Welcome to One Last Take, a podcast about seeing film from every angle. I'm Wes Skinner, and today we've got a lot to cover, including the latest gore fest in the Evil Dead franchise, Olivia Wilde's directorial follow-up to the divisive Don't Worry, Darling, and a discussion about why I refuse to see any more of these Disney live-action remakes. Hope you enjoy. Welcome back to the show where I do weekly reviews of what I saw in theaters and any other movie thoughts I might have from the past week. After a slow couple weeks, we're back to having a handful of movies to talk about. Overall, though, this has been an odd summer. Rather than the steady stream of hyped movies we all expect from this season, it's full of fits and starts. This is mostly due to a lot of the supposed tentpole movies just not performing well, starting with Supergirl, then Minions and Monsters, and now the live-action Moana remake. I want to start here because these are each examples of the types of movies studios have been using as a crutch for the last decade or two, and ironically, all of them seem to be losing steam at the exact same time. Supergirl is the sort of mediocre B-character superhero movie we used to get all the time. But since these have now outnumbered the big event movies that held up the foundation of the genre's success, viewers have grown impatient and frustrated. With the Minions, it's a lot easier to appreciate the shallow turn-your-brain-off kids entertainment when there's an animated masterpiece like Inside Out or Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse just around the corner. But now, not only have these types of subpar kids movies become the majority of family entertainment, but even the most reliable titles like Toy Story aren't quite hitting the same way they used to. And lastly, that brings us to these creatively bankrupt live-action remakes, whose manipulative nature has been called out from the get-go, but have reached a new cynical low in recreating a movie from just 10 years ago. Not to mention one with an animated sequel just a few years back. And Moana was the one where, just from watching the trailers, I finally decided to stop going to these movies, hoping to somehow be pleasantly surprised. They refuse to change any of the designs of the non-human characters, and the human characters are so poorly integrated into the CG that it looks shoddy compared to the original film from a decade earlier. So one can't help but ask themselves, what are we doing here? In all of these examples, the curtain has been lifted. The studio's expectations that they can shovel out the same old shit and make billions of dollars is more obvious than ever, and audiences have finally shown they've had enough. Instead, their money is either going towards new, exciting filmmakers in the horror genre and, for the most part, other things outside of the three types of movies that we've been fed for the last 20 years or so. Of course, that's not to say that big names like Spider-Man and Batman or the eventual live-action Frozen aren't going to make a ton of money. But hopefully this sends out a distress signal to the studios that the floor needs to be raised, and if they're going to continue making the same movies, hopefully they can at least be made with a little more care. So yeah, I knew seeing Moana more so than any of these live-action remakes before it was going to offer me absolutely nothing as a theatrical experience, so I skipped it. And I'm more than fine with that, because while it was a slow week at the box office, the two movies I did see were both pretty damn good. Let's start with Evil Dead Burn, the latest in the quasi-reboot era of the Evil Dead franchise. This series has always been near and dear to my heart, as the original, in all of its low-budget, gritty VHS glory, is one of the first R-rated movies I ever watched. To this day, I regard it as a masterpiece, and while Sam Raimi's two comedic follow-ups and the darker, more serious recent entries don't quite reach those heights for me, I think the series as a whole has sustained a certain level of quality that very few big names in horror have. And I'm happy to say that Evil Dead Burn keeps in that tradition while allowing yet another director to put their bloody stamp on it. Helmed by French up-and-comer Sebastian Vanecek, the film follows Suhaila Yacob as Alice, who, after her abusive husband Will dies in a horrific car accident, spends the night of the funeral with some friends and Will's family, with whom she has a complicated relationship to say the least. It isn't long before whatever came for Will comes for everyone else, and Alice is forced to spend a literal night from hell fighting for her life. At this point, you know what to expect from an Evil Dead movie. While each one has a slight twist, there is a formula. A handful of people go to an isolated, confined setting, someone reads from the Book of the Dead, and everyone except for one unfortunate soul is turned into a deadite, leaving the last one standing to hack, slice, and chop their way to survival. Since 2013, the films have taken a darker, more grounded approach than Raimi's original tongue-in-cheek vision, and that trend continues here. But Vanecek does a great job of setting this one apart with a twisted sense of humor, an American Gothic aesthetic, and extreme gore akin to the French extremity movement of the early 2000s. Most of the graphic set pieces are shot in claustrophobic close-ups, save for a few standout moments, including one tracking shot that completely blew me away. In fact, the camera is doing all kinds of crazy stuff in this movie, honoring Raimi's creative energy from the roots of the franchise, as well as doing some things I can't say I've ever seen before. It helps that it's all set in this gorgeously creepy house that feels like it was ripped from a black and white Vincent Price movie. Now, all of this talk about style might have you wondering how I feel about the actual story, and while it's bare bones, I think it's just enough to get you invested in the main character, even if almost everyone else serves as a meatbag, either brutalizing people or being brutalized. Yakub sells the fear her character holds deep, not just of her late husband, but of the pieces of him she sees in his family, and knowing she can never tell them everything he's done. It's an interesting literalization of trauma and feeling trapped, not unlike things we've seen before, but the relentlessly bleak nature of everything Alice goes through here really amplifies the suffocation she experiences. But ultimately, there's no hiding that this movie is really all about the blood, gore, and viscera. And unlike Evil Dead veteran Lee Cronin's The Mummy, the nastiness is executed with so much style and creativity that it feels more like a spectacle than something the audience is being subjected to. That being said, this type of extreme gore is never going to be for everyone, and for those of you who are sensitive to this stuff but are maybe trying to test the waters with more violent movies, I'll warn you that this is not the one to do it in. It's kind of like jumping in the deep end of the pool, so maybe be careful with this one. And there's really not much else to say, as the movie pretty much gets to where it's going and just revels in the dark, bloody nightmare until the credits roll. The story and characters sort of play second fiddle, with the film focusing more on atmosphere and sustained thrills, which I personally found engrossing. Looking back on this new era of the franchise so far, I think I'd have to say this one is my favorite of the last three. It might run on a little long, and I do think spending just a little more time getting to know these characters beforehand might have paid off, but ultimately this is the exact kind of mean-spirited, bloody good time I want from an Evil Dead movie. Now, I won't say exactly why, but there is reason to believe that they may follow it up with yet another entry, and I'm hoping that the singular identity of these movies doesn't get lost in some sort of cinematic universe. That being said, if they're all being executed as well as this, who am I to complain? Now, I found this past week's other theatrical offering equally thrilling and stressful, though very different than Evil Dead Burn, and that's Olivia Wilde's The Invite. I've been a fan of Wilde since her energetic debut Booksmart, and like everyone else, was left a little baffled by the follow-up Don't Worry, Darling. Now she returns with the clear goal of reestablishing her voice in Hollywood, and I have to say that for the most part, she succeeds. The Invite stars Seth Rogen and Olivia Wilde as a married couple at each other's throats, leading up to a dinner with mysterious neighbors played by Edward Norton and Penelope Cruz. What starts off as an expectedly awkward evening of underlying tension and forced conversation slowly evolves into something different, as secrets are revealed, motivations are uncovered, and everyone is forced to look at themselves and their partner in a new light. Without giving away any of the specifics of the plot, The Invite is a beautifully shot, hilarious, dialogue-driven chamber piece with 4 well-written characters, all portrayed by actors at the height of their power. Rogen uses his natural charm and humor to test how much of an asshole the other characters, and in turn the audience, will let him be. Wilde, on the other hand, harnesses every middle-aged suburban stress and wears it on her face as someone who is somewhat neurotic and controlling on the surface, but genuinely just desperate to please. Norton and Cruz, however, balance the chaos nicely as 2 overly comfortable hipsters who are not only open to, but are excited by the tense nature of their neighbor's home. Despite the rambling nature of the screenplay, the ways in which it explores the relationship between loving someone and being driven absolutely insane by them is fairly nuanced and at times even subtle. Wilde's direction threads the needle perfectly between knowing these characters need to be eccentric enough to be entertaining, but human enough to be relatable. You can tell that every scene is filled with not only passion, but collaboration. This truly feels like every actor got to be a piece of their character, which helps the merging of the real world and the movie world feel all the more engaging. Recent interviews have actually revealed just how much input the actors have had on the dialogue and delivery, and it shows. It also helps the movie pulls off yet another feat, which is showing us 2 main characters who are mostly unlikable through the majority of the runtime, but then still allows us to empathize with them and feel for these characters by the end. While this is obviously in conversation with the works of Woody Allen and Richard Linklater, I also think it makes a suitable pairing with this year's The Drama, as both movies aren't afraid to dwell in the overwhelming anxieties of a relationship that we often try not to think about. Ironically, this unlocks a sweetness in both films because it acknowledges that love can coexist with other much darker feelings. Whether or not 2 people should be together is never obvious, and how The Invite in particular chooses to grapple with that is fairly profound, and if I'm being honest, left me a little teary-eyed by the end. If I had any reservations with the film, I think the jazzy score is slightly overbearing in the beginning, and a few of the observations it makes about relationships are somewhat overexplored at this point. But all of that went away once the film reached a certain point, and I was just wrapped up in the craft and the characters and performances. Overall, I was fully enthralled and entertained, and found this to be one of the most impressive directorial comebacks in recent history. So while the lobby of the theater I work at is still a total ghost town, this last week was not without some gems. And before we wrap up today, I wanted to leave you with some recommendations of older movies I got to catch up with this past week. So in case you're in need of something to watch for the week, maybe give one of these a shot. The first is Ghost World from 2001, directed by Terry Swagoff and based on a comic by Daniel Close. It follows two jaded young women, played by Thora Birch and Scarlett Johansson, who recently graduated high school and are struggling to figure out what to do next. While going wherever her intrusive thoughts take her next, Thora Birch's Enid plays a prank on middle-aged Seymour, played by Steve Buscemi, but eventually forges an unlikely friendship with him based on shared interests and an overall disdain of the norm. This is a charmingly irrelevant comedy with a bubbly color palette that contradicts its character's cynical worldview. I threw this one on out of curiosity and found myself engrossed from the opening scene. It's got some outdated humor here and there, but for the most part the jokes land, and I was surprised by how the ending left it feeling almost like an anti-coming-of-age film. It's hard to describe, but if you see it, I think you'll know what I mean. I should also mention this movie answers the age-old question of whatever happened to that little spunky girl from Hocus Pocus. Well, it turns out she did Ghost World, and it's pretty damn good. The other recommendation I had this week came from cloudy memories of a certain movie on TV I saw as a kid. I recently picked it up from the Criterion sale this week, threw it in at home, and had an absolute blast. And that movie is the 1973 version of The Three Musketeers, directed by Richard Lester, the man who gave us A Hard Day's Night and Superman 2. So yeah, his taste is a little all over the place, but it turns out he knows how to make a solid swashbuckler. The story plays out as it always does, with Michael York as D'Artagnan fumbling his way into becoming a musketeer, and fighting alongside the titular trio of Athos, Porthos, and Aramis against the corrupt cardinal and his eye-patch henchman Rochefort, played by my favorite movie villain actor Christopher Lee. I never really bought York as a leading man until I saw this movie. His D'Artagnan is pretty spot on, being a cross between a hopeful Luke Skywalker and an annoying little shit. In fact, those two tones remain a constant in the movie throughout, giving it an unlikely mischievous energy that works better than I could have imagined. For every painterly visual or thrilling duel, there is some silly, rambunctious antic taking place in the next scene. In other cases, I'd find that kind of obnoxious, but it really works here. The film ends with plenty of unresolved arcs and a trailer for the next film, The Four Musketeers, which I'll probably watch soon and maybe share my thoughts on a future episode. And that's all I've got for the week. The dreadfully slow month of movies is finally going to pick up with the long-anticipated arrival of Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey. Nolan is the subject of some of my more controversial takes, we'll say, so I'm going to share some thoughts and give you some context on my views on his whole body of work before we get into my actual review. And I am grateful I'll be seeing it in IMAX this weekend, so regardless of what I think, I can't wait to share my thoughts with you next week. As always, you can find more of my movie thoughts at one_last_take on Letterboxd. And if you've enjoyed what you've heard so far, feel free to subscribe, tell your friends, or leave a comment below and share your thoughts on these movies. I'd love to hear them. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.